We're here with Paul Fromm of the Canadian Association for Free Expression. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Paul Fromm, the director of the Canadian Association for Free Expression, and I don't think there's ever been a time in this Dominion's history when there's been more need to fight for freedom of speech and freedom of expression. It's under attack on campuses, it's under attack particularly from government institutions and from big businesses who will fire a person at the drop of a hat for the nonviolent expression of their beliefs on their own time. It's a bad time to be anything other than a sheeple in this country.
Well, speaking of time, in the last week you've been involved in a couple of controversies. The first being that you rented some library space for a memorial service, and the other being that you made an appearance at a free speech rally. I'd like to talk about both these incidents very briefly. First of all, can you tell us basically what happened at the library, and why did everybody from city councillors to the mayor get so upset that you were holding a memorial service for an author, a librarian, and a lawyer?
Well, it just demonstrates how depraved the political elite and some of their street followers are in this country. Free speech, they just don't get it. It's rather ironic. We the Canadian Association for Free Expression worked closely with the lawyer, the late Barbara Kalashka, on a number of cases, and we thought we'd like to have a memorial for her. So I find it ironic that people would want to stop a memorial. I think a lot of people would say, well, it doesn't matter whether they're good or bad people, everybody deserves a burial and a farewell. That's all it was. But she fought for freedom of speech her entire legal career. She actually started, as you suggest, as a librarian. She got her Master of Library Sciences, and then she switched into law. And from the very beginning, her issues were freedom of speech and freedom of belief. And she worked very closely for a number of years with Doug Christie on really important cases like the second Zungel case. He was charged under an obscure law called false news. They eventually took it to the Supreme Court, and the law was declared unconstitutional. She then got involved in the famous Immerfinta war crimes case, and the Jewish lobby had gotten this compliant jaw that walks like a man, Brian Mulrooney, to bring in a war crimes law whereby we could prosecute in Canada people who were not Canadian citizens at the time they did something to people in another country at another time, which is utter devastation of Anglo-Saxon law. But anyway, they brought the war crimes law in. The first victim was an old Hungarian musician named Immerfinta. And Finta had been a police captain in Budapest in 1944. He'd been told to move a group of Jews from the city holding area to trains. That's all that's all he did. Well, what they eventually got the Supreme Court to agree to was that following orders is a defense. Now, that's following reasonable orders. If your commanding officer tells you to beat the head in of a little baby, that's not a reasonable order. You can't get off saying, well, just following orders. All the Finta was supposed to do was to move this group of people from here to trains. That's all he knew.
Okay, well, I don't want to get into these specific cases. You've spoken about these particular cases on other films.
Yes.
I'm more interested in why the general, for example, you said nothing out of the ordinary at the Poor Boys rally, which was a rally in support of the Halifax Five a few days later. Yet again, huge controversy with people saying we don't need a neo-Nazi at our rally. Now, it seems to me that nobody's taking into account that these accusations of being a neo-Nazi are basically not true and made by your opponents on the left. Can you address that aspect of this for me?
Yes. Well, if you specifically the accusation of being a neo-Nazi, the term Nazi was never one used by the National Socialists. That was it was a defamatory term dreamed up by their enemies. Nazi was was a corruption of the short form of Ignaz. Ignaz, it was the stereotypical country bumpkin, like in North America we'd say a bubba. Well, they were basically calling the National Socialists more or less bubbas. Well, you wouldn't call yourself a bubba. Neo-Nazi is a Hollywood term. It's an invention that suggests usually a skinhead who goes around beating up people. It's associated with violence and bullying, and I have nothing to do with that.
Do you advocate violence?
Absolutely not. It's actually our opponents that practice violence. The Antifa that try to physically attack people. Just last Sunday, my friend Bill Wadcott was physically attacked by Antifa at an outdoor prayer meeting in Calgary. They're the ones practicing violence, not us. I think what happened with the free speech rally at Queen's Park, it was sponsored by students in support of free speech, which is a U of T group, and some other groups as well. And it was for the Halifax Five. Those are the 5 young guys who protested the Micmac ceremony at the Lord Cornwallis' statue in Halifax. And they sang God Save the Queen, they flew the red ensign, and then they left. It was a nothing sort of thing, but the senior brass in the military wanted to throw them under the bus and kick them out of the military. So I think it was a very righteous protest, and several students spoke, and then they said, would anybody else like to speak? And nobody else did, so they asked a second time, so I went forth, gave them my card, spoke for about 90 seconds, and basically said that what's being done to these young guys is wrong. You should have the right to your own opinion on your own time, and if you feel strongly about it, write to the Minister of National Defense. That was it. People applauded. They liked it. It was only later that some of the Communist Party of Canada, apparently, the Antifa and several other people said, oh, you have Paul Fromm, he was a Nazi, now you're associated with the Nazis. Well, I think the students panicked. They clearly liked what I had to say. Nobody was at the rallies.
Well, that's what strikes me as so ironic about this, is they're having a protest because they feel that these 5 members of the armed forces, who are also members of a boys' club called the Proud Boys, were unjustly maligned as racists. Yet you get up to speak in support of them, and they're doing the exact same thing to you. Are you a racist? I've asked you if you were a Nazi. You said no. Are you a racist? Do you dislike people of other nationalities?
Wow, those are a lot of questions. I'm a white nationalist. I want North America for the European founding settler people. Do I dislike people of other backgrounds? Yes, some of them, others no. It's not a matter of individuals, it's a matter of numbers. We are being replaced by 20-50 people who look like you and me. Will be a minority in the country our ancestors built. That's wrong. We were never asked, and we have to reverse this, or we will become a minority. That's what the battle's about. It's not a matter of hating people of other backgrounds. And if you asked any other people on the face of this earth if they wanted to be replaced, they'd say hell no. And that's what it's all about. What our enemies have been very good at doing is using weaponized words like "you're a racist, so you can't," or "so I must not associate with you," or "you're a neo-Nazi." It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. They've used these terms to divide us. And what they're scared about after Trump changed everything. Up until Trump, that worked. But they shot their bolt on Trump. They called him a white supremacist, a racist, a xenophobe, a misogynist, and a whole lot of other names, and he won. So what it meant was a whole lot of people said, well, I don't care if you call him a racist or a white supremacist or whatever. I understand him and he's for me. And they're terrified of that. And people are now speaking up across Canada. A year ago, the Proud Boys would not have been out there in Halifax. They probably wouldn't have had the stones to do it because they'd be afraid of being called names. Now people are just a little less afraid. And that's what's playing out here.
And do you think that's because so many people have been maligned by being called names like Nazi, racist, misogynist, and so forth?
I think that's true, and I think also Trump encouraged people. He was called all these things, and he won. And I think people are saying, well, look, if they call me a racist, well, Trump's a racist, well, they say he isn't. He's the president of the United States. It's taken a little bit of the sting out of that word. And what the enemy has been very good at doing, like as long as I can remember in politics, is to try to divide us. By saying, well, you can't associate with that person because he's a whatever. Or you've got to repudiate him because he's whatever. If the students in support of free speech stick to their principles, which is they believe in free speech, as long as it's not violent, you don't have to agree with the person, but you have the right to speak. If they stick to that, they'll be safe. Because they don't have to agree with whatever it is some of them may think I believe or don't believe. What I said there was obviously perfectly acceptable. I got a good round of applause. And the enemy is trying to divide us. And I see both among at least on the Facebooks of the Proud Boys and the students in support of free speech, a lot of their members are not going along with their leadership, which is in complete panic mode.
So that's your message to the students for free speech and the Proud Boys. I've also noticed on the Proud Boys page, there were a lot of people who are exposing the philosophy of you don't punch right. In other words, would you say that there's a larger tolerance for people who've traditionally been considered Nazis, that they have a place in the political right? Even though they are such a very, very small faction. But if you look at the left, the transsexuals are a very, very small section of society too, and they seem to make an awful big deal about them and writing laws in their favor. Do you believe that the Nazis have a place on the political right?
Well, absolutely. Everybody has I think there's got to be room for everybody. A philosophy I've followed for a long time is no enemy on the right. If we're not united on certain common goals, like stopping mass immigration, securing free speech, greater individual liberty, if we are not united on those, we will not prevail.
So in other words, free speech no matter what your political belief.
Exactly. What some people can't get through their thick heads is just because somebody says something in a place doesn't mean people agree. Like they said the library was hosting this memorial for Barbara Kalashka, and people with certain views were going to be there. All the library was doing is providing some space. And the library didn't endorse or not endorse the meeting. They're renting space. They're not supporting anything. And just because something is said doesn't mean people have to agree with it. That's what freedom of speech is about. And I think the John Tory showed himself to be an ignoramus. I mean, speaking out against that, he ought to know better. He's a lawyer, or at least he was trained as a lawyer.
Well, and it's pretty clear too that there's not going to be a whole heck of a lot of what they would deem as hate speech at a memorial service.
Yes, and that's one of the things that kind of made me wince at the rally for the Halifax 5. Some of the student organizers fully agreed that there should be that there are laws against hate speech. That there are, unfortunately, and there shouldn't be, because hate speech is incredibly subjective. What it really is speech that somebody hates, usually because it criticizes their particular privileged minority. The homosexual lobby doesn't want criticism of the practices of homosexuality, so they call it hate speech.
So in other words, in your opinion, there should be no hate speech laws at all?
Absolutely. It's been one of the goals of the Canadian Association for Free Expression to repeal all the restrictions on political speech, political and religious speech in Canada. And, well, we got rid of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which is an abomination. The next goal, it's not just around the corner, but the goal is to get rid of Sections 318 and 319 of the Criminal Code. The anti-free speech lobby will say, well, words will lead to actions. Not necessarily. Only if there are actions. If somebody goes and punches somebody in the nose, that's an action. We stop that. If somebody says, I don't like you, you're a this and that and something else, that's fine. Just as long as you keep your fist this side of the guy's nose.
Well, Mr. Fromm, I'd like to thank you for coming in today and clarifying for us your actions over the last couple of weeks. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, what I'd really like to add is speak up. More Canadians are doing it. Find the courage, whatever your issue is, whether it's immigration or free speech, to speak up and speak back. Because the enemies of free speech are very much entrenched in the media, ironically, and in institutions. If more people spoke up, this tyranny that we live under would collapse.
Paul Fromm, elder statesman of the Free Speech Movement, president for Canadian Association of Free Expression. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks.